Thank you, everyone. My name is Chase LaDue. I'm a PhD candidate at George Mason University. For my dissertation, I'm studying male Asian elephant behavior physiology, both in national parks throughout Sri Lanka and then in zoos in the US. Before I start with today's presentation, which is a little offshoot of my dissertation, I want to acknowledge the whole team that's on the slide here because we really came up with this idea together. It was sort of a serendipitous idea, much like other things that happened in Sri Lanka, but I wanted to share it with you guys today. So the theme of this session today is all about human-elephant conflict. And just as in many other places throughout elephant range countries, human-elephant conflict is a continuing problem in Sri Lanka. Last year in 2018, it was estimated that 319 elephant and 96 human deaths resulted just from the conflict throughout the island. And Sri Lanka has a really high concentration of elephants because it's such a small island. However, these huge elephant populations are being concentrated into smaller and smaller areas, much like throughout the rest of the world. This is a map, a survey study from Fernando and his team that was published just this year that shows the change in elephant density or elephant distribution from 1960 to 2015. And so the dark blue color shows areas where both male and female elephants have been sighted, and you'll notice on some of the peripheries you see that light blue color, and that's where male elephants have been spotted without females. So this may indicate that male elephants are utilizing lower quality habitats compared to females. They also surveyed different intensities of human-elephant conflict throughout the island. So the map on the left is the survey map, just where they saw elephants in 2015, and the right is where they surveyed human communities to measure the relative intensity of human-elephant conflict, with the redder areas being more intense areas. And so one thing you'll see is that elephants and humans overlap a lot throughout Sri Lanka. And so humans inhabit about 70% of elephant habitat on the island. And the other thing you'll notice is that the patterns of conflict are not uniform. There's sort of this mosaic pattern throughout the island. There is evidence, which is really relevant for our project, that male elephants are really involved in conflict at a disproportionately high rate. So some of the preliminary evidence coming out of Sri Lanka in particular indicate that in some parts of the country, males may be responsible for as many or as much as 88% of the crop raiding incidents. And so for us, we're really interested in understanding how male elephants behave and respond to each other and to their environments across these different environmental gradients. And there's some theoretical basis for wanting to know more about this. So other studies throughout Asia, not necessarily in Sri Lanka, show that male elephants do have a degree of behavioral plasticity in their responses across these environmental gradients, and so they may behave differently in more protected, pristine environments compared to areas closer to human activity. And that a lot of these changes may be associated with muss, because as we all know, muss induces all these behavioral and physiological changes. So we're also very interested in how muss affects these changes we see across different environments. And so the bigger project questions we have are, how does muss influence how male elephants respond to each other, both males and female elephants, and their environments? And can we use this information to inform conservation and management strategies, both in Sri Lanka and then, as I mentioned at the beginning, in captive environments? And so all of our study sites are located in the north-central province of Sri Lanka, where there's been high rates of human-elephant conflict. So this is just a map of Sri Lanka I pulled off Google Maps, and if we overlay the Fernando et al. Study that looked at human-elephant conflict, you can see that in the north-central region, there's a lot of human-elephant conflict. So the site I'll be talking about today is Waskamua National Park, which Ravi mentioned yesterday too. This is really relevant for human-elephant conflict because this park, although it's protected, it's surrounded by large areas of human agriculture. Our other two parks are Kaurila and Minaria National Parks, a little bit further north. These also have some agriculture in the area, but they're also subject to a lot more tourism. So this is usually where the Western tourists go, not so much at Waskamua, but still huge levels of human activity. But today I'm going to focus on Waskamua National Park, and I'll fill you in why a little bit later. But Waskamua is a fairly large park, especially compared to the rest of the national parks in Sri Lanka, especially in this area. It's 39.3 thousand hectares, and it's considered to have a dry zone climate. There are a variety of habitat types in the national park, including primary, secondary, and riverine forests, and these forest patches are separated by large grassy patches. The data I'll be presenting today, we collected from December 2018 through April 2019, and our data collection is ongoing, but I wanted to show you what we have so far. So this is just a shot of Wascomua National Park taken from inside the park, and it's right near the park edge, so what you're seeing in the foreground is the protected area, and out in the distance you may be able to see some watchtowers, and so these are the beginning of the farmers' fields. And so technically Wascomua is a fenced park, but as I'm sure a lot of you can relate at your field sites, the fencing isn't always adequate. So this is a shot of the fence that separates parkland from agriculture, and so I'm going to highlight the actual structure that's there. So what it's really composed of is 2 or 3 electric wires that may or may not work, and like a lot of areas where elephants live, they like to knock them down a lot too. So hopefully these fences are functioning with electricity, but a lot of times they aren't, and even if they aren't, a lot of times they aren't standing because elephants have figured out how to knock them down. So in theory, elephants should be separated from the agriculture that surrounds the park, but practically they move between the park and the agriculture pretty freely. So our data collection methods for our bigger project questions is we sampled elephants within the national park itself during the park's operating hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., driving on park roads throughout the area. Anytime we encountered elephants, we recorded the age, sex, and location of all the elephants in a group, including female elephants. Whenever we saw a male elephant older than 10 years old, estimated to be older than 10 years, we considered that an adult male for our study, so they were interested for our sampling. So as soon as we spotted these males, 1 or more of them, we conducted behavioral observations with 15-minute vocal animal procedures, and whenever we saw them defecate, we would either wait for them to walk away and collect the fecal sample, or mark it on our GPS and come back later to look at different hormone metabolites that we were interested in for our study. Of course, we wanted to make sure we weren't oversampling some males, so we were very interested in identifying males and maintaining our own database. This wasn't a super long-term project. We're only collecting data for a year or 2, but for our purposes, we came up with an elephant ID book that we used amongst our team, we shared with the national park and different surrounding farmlands. And so we depend on different physical features to distinguish males from each other. Ear shape is a good one, different patterns of depigmentation, tail length, tail shape, tail hair. One thing we could not rely on that a lot of other places you could rely on, especially for male elephants, is tusks. So in Sri Lanka, only between 5 and 10% it's estimated of male elephants have tusks. And there's been some speculation as to why. It's probably a combination of different factors. But the short story of it is that we just couldn't use tusks to distinguish males from each other. However, what surprised us when we arrived in the field and started collecting data is some of the most reliable distinguishing characteristics between males were the scar patterns we observed on their body. So for instance, this male is pretty heavily scarred, and here are some arrows pointing some of the scars we used. And so while we can't definitively say whether these are indicative of gunshots or encounters with humans, we tried to ask the question, could we compare patterns of these scars on different demographic groups of the elephants in our population to understand sort of the patterns of human-elephant conflict that are happening in this area? So, as sort of the serendipitous question, we took photos of all the elephants we could, came back and sort of compared the patterns of scars in the elephants we have photos of. So to choose the photos we used to score the scar patterns, we started with the first photos we had of that elephant, which were the first day they were sighted, and any photos taken within 5 days of that first photo. And so for instance, we have this photo of male number 18, and I had a scoring booklet with a generalized elephant body pattern, and I would just mark the location of any scars that I saw in the photos. And sometimes, of course, the lighting isn't perfect, so I might use the same 2 photos for the same side of the elephant just to make sure I'm getting an accurate image. And then besides just drawing on the picture, we sort of divided this generalized elephant body into 3 different areas: the head, the front of the body, and the rear of the body, to see if different demographic groups exhibited different patterns of these scars. Since this was a male-focused study from the outset, and we didn't think of looking at scar patterns and comparing them between groups, we have obviously more photos of male elephants than female elephants, but we do still have some females. 64 male elephants were scored for this little offshoot of the project, and 38 females. Unfortunately, for a lot of the females, we only had one side because we were focusing on the males, of course. So we looked at the elephants that we had both sides of their body photographed, and we compared the side that had more scars to the side that had fewer scars, and we found that there was no significant difference in sort of lateral scar patterns. So for any elephants we only had one side photographed, we estimated the other side just by doubling the amount of scars. And these patterns were consistent not just in total number of scars, but in the number of scars in each section of the body, head, front, and rear. And so not surprisingly, just comparing total number of scars between males and females, we found that males had a lot more scars than females. So the highest number of scars we found on a single male was 100, whereas the highest number on females we had was just 8. And so we also, like I said, estimated age class for all the elephants. And so what this is showing is the difference between female and male elephants at each of our age categories, 10 to 15 years, 15 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and older than 40 years old. And these sort of show the distribution of the data with the thick black bars in the middle of the boxes showing the median. But now I want to separate the males from the females just so we can see the age patterns. So the first thing, just notice that these are in different scales. It now looks at females had it a lot more, but notice that the highest number is still 8 for the females. And so what we noticed is we really didn't see very many, if not any at all, scars on the younger females until age 20, and that's when we started noticing the scars appear. And they stayed at a fairly consistent level. They didn't seem to accumulate more as they aged. Whereas males, they had substantially more when they were younger, even as young as 10 years old, and they continued to accumulate more scars as they aged. And that was significant between the different age categories. You'll notice the 40-plus age bar is sort of grayed out. That's because we only had 2 males in our sample that were older than 40, so we didn't compare them statistically, and we're not sure whether they continue to increase or if they're sort of staying the same after they hit the 30 to 40 age class. We also scored body condition using the protocol described by Pocarel and her team on wild Indian elephants, and on a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being lowest body condition or the least amount of fat, and 5 being the highest body condition with the most fat. And what's interesting is between males and females, we saw a different pattern of scars based on these. So we had females in the 2, 3, and 4 body condition. There were no significant differences between the scar patterns. We had enough males in 3s and 4s that we could say that the males that had a higher body condition had more scars on their body. And just for males, this was not significant for females. We also noticed that as males aged, they had proportionally more scars towards the front of their body compared to the rear of their body. So you'll notice the 10 to 20 age groups, they have a lot of scars towards the rear proportionally, whereas they continue to get more on their head and the front part of their body as they get older. So what does this all mean? So of course we have to take a leap of faith and say, if we assume these scar patterns are indicative of the levels of conflict experienced by these different groups, we may assume that male elephants engage in human-elephant conflict more than females, and this result is not surprising probably to most, if not all of you, but it's also supported by the literature. We also found that these scar patterns may suggest that male elephants engage in human-elephant conflict earlier than females, and they continue to engage as they age. We don't know if it's they engage more, but we do see that the scar patterns accumulate as they age. Male elephants with a higher body condition engage in human-elephant conflict more, so we assume that this means that they're feeding on more human crops, so they're getting higher body conditions from that. And they may be adopting riskier crop raiding strategies as they age, because we see more towards the front where they would be facing gunfire as opposed to running away where they would accumulate them on the rear part of their body. So these results, like I said, support findings that male elephants engage in the majority of human-elephant conflict, and so this is no surprise. But what this really helps drive home is that when we're considering different mitigation strategies for human-elephant conflict, maybe males deserve special attention as we're talking about special tailor-suited conflict mitigation strategies for certain areas. And so what the rest of our data collection hopes to get at is sort of what's the influence of must in male elephant behavior and physiology? Are there broader effects that we see in these protected areas even when they're away from the crops they're raiding? Are these responses plastic across different environmental gradients? And then, like I said, this is only from one park where there's high amounts of agriculture. Do we see this in other areas of the country too where there might not be as much agriculture? And so while we anticipated being able to collect these data, and what the abstract in your programs indicates that we would, Many of you know about the terrorist attacks that happened that affected our work too, and so we had to suspend our work, but we'll be back next summer to collect more data and compare Waskamua to Kaudala and Area. So I'd like to thank all the collaborators in Sri Lanka and around the world that have directly and indirectly helped with this project. I really depended on a lot of their expertise to sort of navigate the parks. And then of course all my funding sources that supported the work, especially the International Elephant Foundation. So I don't know if I have time for questions, but thank you all for your attention.